And so families end up getting these handouts. They're not consistent with their cultural diet. And then they feel really overwhelmed. And they're like, well, I mean, this is not what we eat. We're not
Yeah.
going to, we can't eat this. And then the family gets labeled as being non-compliant, and the patients have the right to not follow a recommended diet. But you don't want them to not follow a recommended diet because you didn't provide them the education that you should have that matches their cultural diet.
Hey everyone, welcome to Food Culture Curious. I am your host, Arely Gutierrez. As a first-gen Mexican American, and especially now working in healthcare as a dietitian, I have seen firsthand how a lack of cultural inclusion can negatively impact our patients. And I want to help change that. So I started Food Culture Curious to have impactful conversations with healthcare professionals of different cultures and backgrounds to get their insight on how to be more culturally inclusive in our nutrition recommendations. It can make all the difference in the world to our patients. Let's continue this journey together with today's episode. Hey everyone, welcome to Food Culture Curious. My name is Arely. I'm a registered dietitian on a mission to help healthcare professionals be more culturally inclusive in their nutrition recommendations. Today we have a very special guest. Her name is Jackie Rodriguez. She is a speech language pathologist based in Atlanta, Georgia. She works across the lifespan with children with developmental communication disorders and adults with swallowing, cognitive, and acquired neurogenic communication disorders. Jackie is passionate about bilingualism, dementia care, and cultural and linguistic diversity. Welcome, Jackie.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. Thank you for being here. I'm so excited. You're my first speech language pathologist on the show. So I'm really happy to have
Woohoo!
you. I definitely want Food Culture Curious to reach beyond dietitians and really enter different spaces in healthcare. So thank you so much for being here.
Sure, I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. All right, so let's jump right into it. Talk a little bit to us about what food cultures you identify with, and particularly what kinds of foods you grew up with.
Yeah, so I come from a really multicultural, diverse background. My dad is Puerto Rican and my mom is African American. And on my dad's side of the family, my family has been here for 3 generations. So my family came here from Puerto Rico in the early 1900s when Puerto Rico became annexed as a territory of the United States. And so if you know anything about like multi-generational families from different cultural backgrounds other than US backgrounds, a lot of times the heritage language is gone by the third generation, but food is one of the strongest parts of the culture that tends to remain. And then on my mom's side of the family, so my mom's father, he was the son of immigrants. His father was from Antigua and his mother was from Barbados, very small islands in the Caribbean. And then my mom's side, they were from Savannah, Georgia. And our ancestry on my mom's side of the family is Gullah people. And so if you're not familiar with the Gullah or the Geechee people, they are people who they're a cultural group that comes from the coast of Georgia and South Carolina. So Geechee being from Georgia, Gullah being from South Carolina. So these people, this culture developed from slavery. And so this culture developed from the rice plantation slavery that happened in the Carolinas and in Georgia. And these Geechee and Gullah people were very isolated from white Americans. And as a result, were able to maintain a lot of their culture. And so the short answer to your question is and then one other thing, my parents are both from New York, but I was born in Georgia. So lots of different cultures influencing my upbringing. So at home, we had a mix of soul food. We had rice with every meal. That is a nod to, my mom's Gullah ancestry and the rice plantations. It's very common in Caribbean families. And it's very common in Puerto Rican culture too. So we either had white rice or we had Spanish rice. And then Southern food as well.
Awesome. Well, tell us a little bit about particularly what dishes were very prominent in your family growing up, either from, the soul food side, Puerto Rican side, and everything in between. What do you remember?
I feel like our main dishes were more like your typical like American dishes, like chicken, pork chops. I remember when my mom was in school, she went back to school when I was in elementary school, and like pork chops is like her fast thing that she would make a lot. We would have a lot of plantain as a side on Sundays. So I was raised in a Black Southern Baptist church. And so in our culture in the South, on Sunday, you have a big Sunday dinner. And so oftentimes that would happen at church. And that would be things like fried chicken, mac and cheese, green beans, collard greens, banana pudding, like a punch that's really popular in the South. And it's kind of like Kool-Aid, but it's also got like, usually it's like ginger ale. I want to say it's called like Southern Comfort Punch, but I don't quote me on that. And then lots of sweet tea as well, being raised in the South. That was big as well. And then from the Puerto Rican side, pork is huge.
Mhm.
So we eat like pernil, which is a pork shoulder, lots of different starchy vegetables, red fruit.
Are any of those dishes or any dishes you haven't mentioned pretty prominent during holiday time? Are there any specific foods you see more during the holidays?
Yes. So I think our holiday meals are just really unique in our family because it's a nice combination of both soul food and Southern food, as well as Puerto Rican food. So typically, pernil, the pork roast, is a huge thing for Christmas time in Puerto Rican culture. Another thing that's very common in Puerto Rican culture is a drink called coquito. I would describe it kind of like the consistency of a milkshake, maybe. It's not quite as thick, but it's made with coconut milk, coconut cream, condensed milk, and evaporated milk. And I've also made it with ice cream sometimes. I'll substitute the like non-coconut milks with ice cream. That's a more non-traditional way. And then some people add like an herbal tea. You'll put like cinnamon, star anise, cloves, and then you'll
Mhm.
put a little bit of water and you make a tea out of that. And then you add the tea to your blender and you add that with your coconut cream, coconut milk, evaporated milk, and condensed milk, and the spices and the flavor of it. It's just so good. And then you put it into the refrigerator, and it's a chilled drink. So it's basically Puerto Rican eggnog. And so we call it coquito. And oh, the most important thing some people would say is you also add rum to it. So that's a very Puerto Rican drink that we have on Christmas. Another common Puerto Rican food for Christmas, I don't particularly care for them, so I don't make them, are pasteles. And pasteles to Puerto Ricans are like, oh my gosh, why can I?
Tamales?
Yes, tamales to Mexican culture. So it's made with boiled bananas or unripened plantains. You boil them, and then inside you add meat. So usually it's like pork. Some people put raisins in theirs, and then it's wrapped in banana leaves. So it's just not my thing. It's not a textural thing, and I think a lot of people will be like, "Wow, she's not really Puerto Rican because she doesn't like." But
That's
that's another.
okay.
Yes, but that's another very Puerto Rican thing to have at Christmas time. And so our Christmas meal usually looks like pernil, and I would always make it, even though my mom wasn't Puerto Rican, she learned how to make it from a close Puerto Rican friend. And then as she got older, my husband and I and my brother kind of took over preparing that. And then we'll have arroz con gandules, which is rice, Spanish rice, and pigeon peas. And then we'll have sweet potatoes, mac and cheese, and collard greens. And then collard greens in the Black culture is also super important. It's like a good luck food for New Year's Eve. So we usually make a huge pot of collard greens that last us from Christmas all the way to New Year's Eve. And then an auspicious food in the Black culture and the African American culture is black eyed peas as well. So those are my holiday foods.
That's awesome. It's so nice to see just how a person and a person can get married. It's not just when they create children, it's not just them that blend, but you see also their cultures blend. Like in the food right in front of you, you see both of them in there.
Yes, yes. And it's funny because my husband is African American and he's gotten to the point now where like when it's a couple weeks before Christmas, he's like, are we making the bed meal again? Like, do we need to go get one or are your parents gonna get it? So it's been nice to see like him become accustomed to my family's unique culture as well.
It's the blending of cultures.
Mhm.
Oh,
And then to add to, I was going to say on my husband's side of the family, so my husband is African American, and his family eats a lot of the traditional, like African American foods that come out of slavery as well. So many of the foods that we call African American foods today are foods that during slavery, enslaved people were given basically the scraps.
mhm.
So things that were seen like weeds, things like collard greens, we were given. And then we also brought things with us from Africa. And I feel like more of that survived in the South. So in my husband's family, you'll see things like okra, which came from West African culture. His family also eats things like pig's feet and chitlins, which are pig intestines. And so those are foods that traditionally came out of slavery.
Do you feel after being with your husband now, you have those foods more often? Did that influence your food culture, or is it no?
No. But it's important to understand the history and where it came from, and that our ancestors, they didn't have as much access to foods as we did now. And so they took what they were provided and made, meals out of the things that they were given, and that survived for so long. So I don't personally like eat those foods, but it's important to also understand our culture and that like cultures of survival and where those foods came from.
Yeah, exactly. A couple of similar things. For example, how fajitas now are such a staple dish in like Tex-Mex culture. The reason that we even started cooking fajitas was like you said, we were given the scraps, right? What was left over from the animal. And you also see a lot of Mexican dishes that feature intestines or things like that because, it was cheaper.
Yes, absolutely.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. I love learning about the mixture of cultures in your family and the foods that your family ate. So I'd like to learn a little bit more about you on the professional side. Can you talk to us a little bit about what made you become a speech language pathologist? What drew you to that career path?
So, my mom had rheumatoid arthritis. She was diagnosed when I was 18 months and she recently passed away. So, I have pretty much exclusively known my mom as a person with a disability. And as I was growing up, she, had a couple of rehab stays. She went to physical and occupational therapy. And so that was just my experience that, my mom had a disability and my life experience was always being her daughter and also in a way being her care partner.
Yeah.
Like as a child, I knew how to get out of my seatbelt or out of my car seat because sometimes if my mom was in a flare, she couldn't get it on her own. So she taught me to use my
Mm.
elbow and push the button to get myself out. And so originally I knew I wanted to go into a helping field just because of my experience with my mom. But no offense to my PT and OT colleagues, but physical therapy was my, first career trajectory. And I was like, this is kind of boring. Like, this is just not my thing. And so I saw a documentary called Here and Now, here being spelled HEAR. And it was about a woman whose deaf parents decided in I want to say they were in their 50s or 60s to undergo cochlear implantation. If you're not familiar with what a cochlear implant is, it's a hearing aid that's surgically implanted for people who have like profound sensorineural hearing loss. And they worked with an audiologist in the documentary. And I want to say that they might have worked with a speech pathologist, but after seeing that documentary, it piqued my interest and I did some research and I was like, whoa, this is actually really cool. And coming from a multicultural background, culture has always been something that was really important to me. And I've always had like a very diverse group of friends. And I felt like it was a lot easier to incorporate my love of diversity into my career as a speech language pathologist than it would have if I had chosen to go into one of the other disciplines. So.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So in becoming speech language pathologist, and correct me if I'm wrong, you speak Spanish?
Mhm.
Okay, awesome. I
Yeah.
know you care a lot about bilingualism. How do you bring in that cultural side as far as being bilingual yourself and then seeing what role that plays in being a speech language pathologist?
Yeah, so our field is 92% white, 8% people of color. It's 3% Black. I believe it's 8% Latino. Actually, I don't think I don't know the exact data point for Latino, but I know it's 8% of us are people who identify as a multilingual service provider, meaning that we speak more than one language.
Mhm.
So when you think about the statistics in my field, versus the demographics of the United States, there's a huge mismatch. And so we're not an accurate reflection of the diversity of this country. Um, and so that's one of my things that I'm really passionate about. I also, and like I mentioned, I'm a third generation Puerto Rican American. And statistically, typically by the third generation, the heritage language is gone. And I am the only cousin in my generation that speaks Spanish. And so something that has been really important to me in my field too is encouraging heritage speakers, whether they're native heritage speakers or non-native heritage speakers like me, to use their skills as speech language pathologists. When I first started, ASHA is the American Speech Language Hearing Association. They've changed as the culture has changed in the United States. They have changed the way that they approach bilingual service delivery. But when I first started, there's a lot of documentation on ASHA's website that was like, you have to have native proficiency or near native proficiency. And if you speak two languages, you know that, you never have equal
Mhm.
skills across your two languages. Many of us were not educated if you're a native speaker, you likely weren't educated in your native language in school. And oftentimes, if you were, it wasn't from people who were from the Latino community. And there's a huge emphasis on Castilian Spanish. We don't see a lot of affirmation of Latin American Spanish dialects. And so, because of that, there's a lot of bilingual SLPs with imposter syndrome that feel like they don't belong in our field, that feel like their Spanish skills are not enough. And I've dealt with that myself, especially as a non native speaker. And I think connecting with other bilingual SLPs has made me realize, like, oh, there's native Spanish speakers that also feel the way that I feel. So, in addition to my work as a clinician, I am part of an organization called the Bilingual Empowerment Through Allied Mentorship Program, BEAM SLP. We actually just recently turned it into a 501c nonprofit. And it's an online program, and we offer mentorship to bilingual SLPs who are doing their clinical fellowship or who are in undergrad or in a grad program, and to kind of help close that gap and help our bilingual SLPs to feel more confident in the field.
That's amazing. And I definitely can resonate with that because it's very similar in dietetics, right? I think only maybe 6% are of a Hispanic or Latin background or identify as. So there's definitely, like you said, that mismatch. You have all this need of the patients, but we don't have the providers to match that need. So
Mm-hmm.
the work you're doing is so important. And I first came across you on Instagram because you had done a post about taking into consideration if someone is on the dysphagia diet, that there are certain dishes that are appropriate for each different level that also accommodates their cultural food, something that they feel familiar with and might feel more doable for that. Can you talk a little bit about what inspired that post and what were the dishes that you referred to?
Yeah, so as speech language pathologists, we treat people who have swallowing disorders. And when you have a swallowing disorder, one of the things that we can do is modify the texture of your diet to make it safer and prevent aspiration of food or solid. So prevent food from going down towards your lungs, creating inflammation and causing pneumonia. And we use different diet standards to just help us with making our recommendations for how to modify a diet. In the past, we had the National Dysphagia Diet System, which was just its guidelines for how to modify your diet. And then more recently, we have IDSI, which stands for the International Dysphagia Diet Standardization Initiative, IDDSI. And so this initiative has given our patients with dysphagia more options for how to modify their food. So, the most restrictive diet is going to be everything is pureed and blended. And then your least restrictive diet is going to be being able to eat whatever foods you want. And then you have a couple of diet levels in between. So, your meat might be softer, it might need to be cut into small pieces, it might need to be minced and served in a thick sauce to help prevent aspiration from happening. And so I will say that IDSI has done a better job to try to diversify our diet recommendations than the National Dysphagia Diet, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And so basically, IDSI creates these guides that show these different diet levels and then give examples of foods that are consistent with the texture that is safest for the person with dysphagia. And so, a lot of times, these handouts that are created, whether it's IDSI or whether it's a handout that an SLP has made themselves, have a lot of usually see one of two things. You either see a lot of like American, like USian type foods, or you see British foods. And you don't see, even within like American, it's very white American foods. You don't see soul food recommended. You don't see Latino foods recommended. You don't see Asian foods recommended. And so what ends up happening is you have these families who are given this handout that does not reflect their cultural foods. And then also sometimes the SLP is not making enough of an effort in their education to explain that you don't necessarily have to eat these foods that are on this list. You have to eat foods that are the same texture and are prepared the same way as these foods. And so families end up getting these handouts. They're not consistent with their cultural diet. And then they feel really overwhelmed. And they're like, well, I mean, this is not what we eat. We're not
Yeah.
going to, we can't eat this. And then the family gets labeled as being non compliant.
Mm-hmm.
And that is very dangerous for our families. And it also poses a risk. You don't want someone to like not follow, patients have the right to not follow a recommended diet, but you don't want them to not follow a recommended diet because you didn't provide them the education that you should have that matches their cultural diet. And then they end up having either a choking event or an aspiration event that puts them in the hospital with pneumonia. And so on my Instagram page, I did it for Hispanic Heritage Month and I also did it for Black History Month. And I've taken different cultural diets and I've just given some examples of how to modify them in order to meet the standards for these different modified diets that we have. So, for example, I gave the example of pork. So, pork is a very hard, difficult texture to eat. So if you're on a regular diet, you could have the skin, the chicharrón is the best part of the pork. If you're on more of a minced and moist diet, so that's going to look like you're going to want that pork to be minced into super small pieces. And then maybe you're going to put mojo sauce on it to make it nice and wet so that it forms a cohesive bolus, a cohesive ball in your mouth as you go to swallow it. We also might look at different fruits. So, we have our standard apples, bananas, grapes here in the United States, but other countries might eat mangoes and guava and soursop and other fruits that we aren't accustomed to eating here. So just considering, is this a super grainy texture? Is this a fruit that has a lot of liquid in it? And if this is someone that is aspirating thin liquids, we usually recommend avoiding those types of fruits that have a lot of liquid in them, because when you go to swallow them, they could potentially go down towards your lungs. Or maybe you're just going to acknowledge that, these are riskier foods for you to have. So, yeah. So I've made it a mission. And, I can honestly say that, like, I'm one of the few SLPs that I know of that
Mhm.
is actually talking about, like, how to modify these diets so that they are culturally appropriate.
Yeah, well, the only one I've seen for sure. But I love it. Those posts are so helpful. And do you have any examples of a patient you've come across that you were able to use these resources with?
Yeah, so for Black History Month, I had, and also one other thing. So this has not been like just me thing. Like, I recruited the help of a lot of other speech language pathologists, some of whom don't even treat dysphagia, and then also just personal friends who are from these different backgrounds to give me examples of their cultural food so that I can make these posts. So I want to acknowledge all these other people that helped me, because I can't really take the credit for everything. But one of the cultures that I made a post about was Jamaican culture. And I had a family who this particular patient was going home on a modified diet. And I printed out some of my recommendations for Jamaican foods. And you could just see, like, they were really happy to have some ideas for how to prepare their cultural foods. I also had a patient who I wasn't even working on dysphagia with. I was working on cognition with her. This was a patient who was having some trouble with her memory. And I was able to use, she was Haitian, and I was working with her with an interpreter. And we did an activity where we were going through the pictures of Haitian foods that I was familiar with because of my posts, and just talking about, like, do you eat this at home? Do you not eat this? And she just thought it was like the funniest thing ever that I knew these foods. And then I was like, I would try to pronounce them without using the interpreter. And she would like laugh at my like horrible like French. So that was like, it's been a great way to also just build rapport with my patients as well.
Yes, that connection is so important. And you really hit the nail on the head because it's the lack of resources more than anything that makes it so difficult to implement being culturally inclusive. But if you have that cultural piece to reference, I feel like that can be super helpful. So having those
Mhm.
posts must be really helpful for the patients.
Yes, yeah. And it's important too, because there's so many layers to when we're working with people with dysphagia. A lot of times, people can have chronic or acute dysphagia, and oftentimes our patients have acute dysphagia. And so you have to consider, like, these are people who have just had a stroke, who have just had a traumatic brain injury, maybe a patient who has dementia and they're now moving into like a more advanced form of dementia. And so you've already have this disability piece where this patient is now coping with and maybe grieving the fact that they have a disability and having to
Mm.
accept this new identity as a disabled person. And then you're changing their cultural diet, and food is so comforting to people, right? That's what so many people see as a form of comfort. So now, like, we want to help usher people into their identity as disabled people. And if you're not pulling in that cultural piece as well when you're making diet recommendations, like, that can make their identity as a disabled person feel even more isolated. That, like, now I can't just eat whatever I wanted to like I did before. Now I have to take small bites or alternate, take a bite and take a sip. And I have to make sure, this is the right texture. And now you're telling me that I can't have my cultural foods either. So it's so important to think about all these different factors when we go to make our recommendations.
Exactly. You've already given us so many amazing takeaways. I really appreciate that. But are there any final takeaways that you want specifically dietitians, but all healthcare professionals to keep in mind when making those diet recommendations more culturally inclusive?
Yeah, so I think even more broadly, I think my greatest recommendation to dietitians would be understanding the signs and symptoms of dysphagia. So, things you want to look out for is if you've had a patient who is complaining of coughing, having food getting stuck in their throat, if they've lost weight out of nowhere, there's no explanation in their medical history for it. If they've had pneumonia recently, maybe it's hard to diagnose aspiration pneumonia versus community acquired pneumonia. So they could have been incorrectly diagnosed as having community acquired pneumonia when it was actually aspiration pneumonia. And they've gotten discharged from the hospital and now have a consult with the dietitian. And so you could play a great role in saying, oh, let's have you go to a speech language pathologist. And I think that if you could make connections with, if you know that you're working with a certain clientele, and if there happens to be an SLP that comes from that same culture and background, I know that considering the statistics, it's not always easy for that to happen, but it does make a really big difference.
I will definitely keep that in mind. I know in dialysis in particular, it can be hard because so many patients are already getting pneumonia from the fluid going into their lungs because of, if they're drinking too many fluids or we're having issues getting that fluid off. But keeping in mind, like you mentioned, is there coughing present? Is there weight loss that's been unexplained? That's a really great tip. Thank you. Perfect. Well, thank you so much for your time, Jackie. If people want to work with you, how can they find you?
So you can find me on Instagram at unlearnwithme.theslp. I also have a Facebook page by the same name. You also can find me on LinkedIn, Jackie Rodriguez.
Perfect. Well, thank you again so much for being here. This was an awesome conversation. I know anyone who's listening is going to learn so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Perfect. All right, everyone. Until next time. If you are interested in supporting this podcast, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/foodculturecurious. Or as always, you can support by sharing, following, or rating this podcast. Every click from y'all means the world to me. And now for a quick disclaimer. Food Culture Curious is for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not take the place of medical advice from licensed healthcare professionals. If you need to seek medical advice, please speak to your healthcare provider. Thank you for listening.